Hi everyone, and welcome to part 1 of our video series on deploying Confluence Data Center on Microsoft Azure. In this video, we'll take you through the steps of understanding the Azure architecture overview and preparing your environment for deployment. But first, let's talk about some of the benefits of deploying Confluence Data Center on Azure. You may be wondering why you would choose a cloud or infrastructure as a service vendor like Azure to host your products. If you're not yet ready to move to Atlassian managed cloud products, but your organization is looking for the benefits that cloud offers, such as scalability and cost savings, then IaaS is a great choice. With this option, you can still have the control over your instance that a self-managed edition provides, while minimizing time, effort, and money spent on managing the instance. Deploying on an IaaS vendor like Azure means better scalability and increased performance at a fraction of the cost. This method also gives you the opportunity for increased automation and modernization. As for cluster-ready environments, clustering is key to ensuring high availability for your products. If you are planning on deploying Confluence in a clustered architecture, doing so on Microsoft Azure also brings its fair share of benefits, such as giving you the ability to scale your deployment elastically by resizing and quickly launching additional nodes. It also provides a number of managed services that work out of the box with Confluence Data Center. These services make it easier to configure, manage, and maintain your deployment's infrastructure. Now, before we jump into the architectural components of your deployment, it's important to note that we recommend you set up your user management, central logging storage, backup strategy, and monitoring, just as you would if you were deploying on your own hardware. You should also know that there are two different options to deploy Confluence Data Center, depending on if you'd prefer Synchrony, the engine that powers our collaborative editing functionality, to run on its own dedicated nodes or not. For the purposes of this video series, we're going to walk through the deployment as if you're running both Synchrony and Confluence on the same cluster node. However, if you want Synchrony and Confluence processes to run on separate nodes, the setup will look something like this. You'll see we have the Confluence cluster in the center at the top and the Synchrony cluster beneath it. And we use ELB v2, otherwise known as an Application Load Balancer or ALB, because we need to be able to direct traffic to the Confluence cluster or to the Synchrony cluster as required. Those two clusters then communicate with the shared home of the highly available Azure File storage and the RDS Postgres database. Now, let's take a look at the architecture overview for deploying Confluence Data Center on Azure using our Quick Start template. This is the simplest way to get started with your deployment using Azure, and we have Quick Start templates available for Jira Software, Jira Service Management, and Bitbucket as well. First and foremost, the deployment contains one or more Azure Standard VM instances as clustered nodes in a scale set. As mentioned earlier, each cluster node can run Confluence Data Center and Synchrony collectively. This way, you don't need to provision extra nodes to enable collaborative editing. On top of that, running Synchrony and Confluence on the same cluster node can help keep your Azure costs down due to less EC2 instances. But it's important to remember that the Synchrony process is memory intensive, so you'll need to select instance types with enough memory to run both Confluence and Synchrony comfortably. The template also provisions an Azure Files storage account for the shared home. This shared home stores attachments and other files accessible to the application cluster nodes. It's mounted as a SAN drive on each node and treated normally like any other file. The deployment then consists of the following remaining components. A Bastion host, which is a lightweight but highly secure Azure Linux VM that controls SSH access to the application cluster nodes. An application gateway that, by default, is composed of two instances for high availability. It will act as an HTTP/HTTPS load balancer for your scale set of application nodes. The configuration of Azure monitoring to perform basic health and availability monitoring to cluster nodes and database. And finally, the database itself. You can choose between Azure SQL Database, MS SQL Server compatible, or Azure Postgres Database. Either way, the database will be configured as service endpoints to only allow traffic from the private network that the cluster nodes are in. This restricted traffic setup helps enhance security. Keep in mind, however, that there are a couple of limitations to be aware of before deciding to deploy Azure. For one, auto-scaling is not yet available due to a problem with Hazelcast, which Confluence uses to discover nodes. And two, if a node is deleted manually, it can't be redeployed without first removing the cluster. The existing database and the existing shared home directory won't be removed when redeploying. In preparation for your deployment, we have a few more recommendations for how to further set yourself up for success. Before you begin, you should use Confluence Data Center load profiles to determine the size of your site. This information will help you choose the right infrastructure size during deployment. You should also decide which Azure region is best for you. Some services, such as Application Insights and Azure SQL Analytics, may not be available in all regions. You can check this out at one of the links in the description box below. During the deployment, you'll also need 1. Your database details. If you want to use an existing Azure database service, you'll need the database URL, port, username, and password. 2. A base64 encoded PFX certificate from a trusted certificate authority. And 3. Details of your existing CNAME, if you don't want Azure to generate a random domain for you. And that's what you need to know in advance of deploying Confluence Data Center using Azure Quick Start Guides. Be sure to tune in to part 2 of this video series, where we walk you through the actual deployment process using the Quick Start Guide from the Microsoft Azure Marketplace. If you're interested in starting your journey with a free trial of Confluence Data Center, you can do so by following the corresponding link in the video's description box below.